Hey everybody, you are listening to Canary Cry Radio. I am your best buddy Basil.
And this is Gons. Welcome to episode number 153. And this is kind of weird. This is Canary Cry Radio. I don't think we...
Been a while,
do we do this show still, or what's the deal?
Well, you're not the only one asking that question. We thank you very much for all your messages, and we've replied to as many of them as we can. You may have noticed what has it been? A year? More than a year and a half?
The last episode we published was on October, so not quite a year. But
on October in 2020?
Yeah, October 29th, 2020 was the last time we published an episode on the RSS feed.
Yeah, so we've put out 2 episodes in a year and a half now. So take that. But yes, I guess for those who may have missed that, I'm sure we talked about it. I don't remember. October seems like a lifetime ago, but here we are again. And we haven't not been working. In fact, we've been working very diligently and hard and often. If you have not checked out Canary Cry News Talk yet, that is where most of our energy goes these days. And honestly, I don't know about you, Gons, but I'm not necessarily sorry about it.
No, I think that the shows that we did without a guest on Canary Cry Radio throughout its existence became Canary Cry News Talk, and then it's evolved even beyond that, where we're tackling all of the issues and stories of the day or the week. We're bringing the biblical worldview, but we're also having a lot of fun doing it, and trying to make people laugh and having a good time, because otherwise it's a really dark place out there right now.
Yes, the world is a different place than it was even since 2019 or January 2020 when we completely ceased being consistent here on Canary Cry Radio. But I know that that's interesting that you say that about the solo episodes or the duo episodes of Canary Cry Radio, because a lot of people have told us that those are their favorite episodes of Canary Cry Radio. Of course, we love our guests. We're so thankful to our guests for sharing their knowledge and research with us. But there's just something so fun about just doing a show with my buddy Gons. And there also was some resistance to a certain crowd within Canary Cry Radio listenership, some resistance to hopping on over to Canary Cry News Talk. Now, if you remember, we've been doing News Talk since about 2016 or so. Started out as a half-hour show once a week where we kind of sped through some fun robot news or something. But if you don't know, now you know. It has sort of developed into a oftentimes 3 or 4 hour journey through the news of the day. And here's the thing. I get it. A lot of people are resistant to more news. Oh my gosh, I have so much news. Who wants the news? But it's not just the normal stuff. Gons and I, we read through 200 articles a week. We bring you what we believe we as Canary Cry, what we believe is the most important, relevant, news in the context of the things that we've been talking about for almost 10 years now. And so have we actually hit 10 years? No, we're over 9 years. Yeah, we're coming up on 10 years. So it's the same Canary Cry worldview, same Canary Cry attitude, but in a different format than you may be familiar with, even if you tuned in to Canary Cry News Talk before the pandemic. Let's be honest. We started doing this at the beginning of quarantine, and we just followed where the Lord led us, and it led us to doing Canary Cry News Talk in this new format. We do it 3 times a week. It's an incredible amount of content that we're putting out over there. And so we hope you understand that has sort of taken the majority of our energy over the past year and a half. But That being said, we do still occasionally interview people, and we will be putting out, not going to promise any sort of frequency, but we will be putting out interviews on here, Canary Cry Radio. We'll also be posting this on the Canary Cry News Talk feed. So if you're already a Canary Cry News Talker, you're welcome. And also, if you haven't done it yet, check out Canary Cry Radio. It's a good show.
Yeah. And the typical Canary Cry News Talk, as you said, goes from anywhere between 2.5 hours at the shortest to, I think we've had one that neared 5 hours, which is crazy, 3 times a week. And because we are skipping out on the July 5th, which is the day that this is being published for Canary Cry News Talk, we thought we would publish our conversation, or at least my conversation with Dr. Future, Mike Bennett, because it goes over 3 hours or so. And it's one of those conversations that we've been sitting on for a little bit, but I think it's time we release this conversation. One thing to note is that the YouTube channels have gone through some issues. The Canary Cry Radio YouTube channel has been shut down by YouTube. It got terminated. And as of this recording, Face Like the Sun was basically pronounced dead. But I think the Lord worked on somebody's heart over there while reading an appeal that I made. And it's back up for now, but that's not going to last. And
it's back up, but you cannot post or stream from it.
Right.
So it is sort of like, here it is for a little bit. Yeah. Download it, like save your data, save your content, because we're going to delete it later. Yeah.
Here's your opportunity. Here's your exit opportunity. But on the Face Like the Sun YouTube channel, as well as the Canary Cry Radio channel, we were interviewing people. And we actually have about 5 interviews that we've been sitting on to actually move from the YouTube conversation to the proper RSS feed here. And so and we switched it up because the Dr. Future interview is going to be moved up. Not for any other reason than, it's just a really good conversation. Nothing against the other conversations we've had, but it's just a timely interview that I think needs to be published. So just keeping in mind that, we have other interviews that we're sitting on that hopefully we can get out there in some kind of appropriate time dilation.
So we'll be attempting to get the time dilation. We'll be attempting to get those out as soon or as frequently as we possibly can. But if you're an old timer Canary Cry Radio listener, and maybe you gave Canary Cry News Talk a chance a few years ago, I would suggest checking it out again. Not going to say guaranteed you'll love it, but there's a lot of people who love it, and Gons, you and I love it. So if you could, as a personal favor, just check out Canary Cry News Talk again. You can find it on any podcatcher, as well as a flurry of different streaming services, video services online. And a great way to get connected with the whole Canary Cry News Talk infrastructure is to head to canarycry.party. You heard me correctly. Canarycry.party, a real URL that you can visit and find all the links to get your Canary Cry News Talk fix. I think that's it, Gons. I do want to say this conversation is one between yourself and Dr. Future. Of course, Dr. Future being sort of one of the fathers or grandfathers. Just kidding, Dr. Future, of sort of our fringy independent community. We love him very much. We look to him as a type of mentor or role model, and we hope you enjoy this. Gons, you spent a lot of time with him during this interview. I'm very jealous, but I'm going to have a good time listening.
Yeah, we talked about his book, 2 Masters and 2 Gospels, Volume 1, and we really got into America's PSYOP to build a spiritual industrial complex.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's quite disturbing at times, but also I think it's good to fill in some gaps, connect some dots to things people already know. And given what we've seen in the last year with the lockdowns and the pandy and all that kind of stuff, I think it's a good history lesson on how the evangelical church, specifically in the United States, was weaponized. And I think there's a little bit of that going on today as well. There's a lot of parallel that, again, disturbing at times, informative at other times, but also, getting into some individual characters that you may or may not have heard of that have been influential in the evangelical church, and as well as talking about G.K. Chesterton and his view on capitalism and socialism and something called distributism, which I'm becoming more of a distributist, Basil, as I go along. It's I'm seeing a lot of sense in what G.K. Chesterton was talking about about 100 years ago, while he was seeing the rise of the Industrial Revolution taking over some of the lives and really the cities and everything of people. And it's pretty much continued on since then. And now that we're on the precipice of the Great Reset and the Agenda 2030 UN Sustainable Development Agenda and the ESG initiative and all these types of things, it's a good time to reflect back on what some of the people 100 years ago were saying when a lot of that was starting in earnest. So it's a good conversation. Dr. Future has done tons of research on it. I recommend the book. Let's just get into it, because it's a lot. It's a lot to take in.
Okay, sounds good. And remember to go to canarycry.party. Canarycry.party. Okay, Dr. Future, let's go.
Wanted to start out by seeing how you're doing. How have you been? It's been a long time since you've been on the show. We know you've been writing books upon books, but just wanted to see how you've been holding up over there.
Well, I have been waiting for eternity to get back on this show. And that's why I've hounded you forever. And you've shown interest, and then you get busy with obviously lesser important things than me. But
obviously,
anyway, you have been things like producing real content and things. So I'm just glad to talk to all the Canary Cry audience. They've always been so kind to me, like you have. Look past my faults, giving me benefit of the doubt. And if there was ever a time that I need them to give me the benefit of the doubt and to know that I have godly motives, these are the days.
Yeah.
Because this is the time everybody needs to fly their flags. Put your cards on the table, decide who you're with, and circle that and narrow that focus to Jesus, and then there's everybody else.
Yep.
And so everybody really needs to let everybody know what they're really about. And we're going through days where people are reassessing who they'll affiliate with, who they'll do. I mean, it's like what Jesus talked about, in the New Testament. He says, you're going to lose fathers, sons, daughters, but then you're going to gain other ones here and in the kingdom to come. The last 5 years, I have lived that in spades.
Yeah. I often think about that.
A ton of people who support me, a ton of people. But you know what? I've met some new friends who are going the same path I am.
Yeah.
And they love Jesus, and they have similar altruistic goals. And I thank the Lord for that. But it's still a lonely walk.
Yeah.
But, you can take the other path of just trying to be a people pleaser and try to get as large a crowd behind you as you can. And don't say anything controversial. Don't make people uncomfortable, and you could get a big crowd, be a very positive message. But are you accomplishing anything for the kingdom?
Right.
When this all burns?
Yeah.
You don't try to pick fights unnecessarily and no rebel without a cause.
Right.
But there's a lot of cause of right things to be rebellious about, even just within the Christian community.
Yeah.
And so, that's where I'm at. And that's why I'm just so thankful. Somebody who doesn't even have to agree with me, and I'm talking about you and your audience, but will give me the time of day to make my case. Because I'm of the camp that, if you can say it in 10 words, why not say it in 100? So, it takes me a while to sort of spit out where my mind has been going. But I feel more certain than ever that I'm on a surer path, the path of the cross and the path of the gospel message. But it sure rubs a whole lot of Christian people the wrong way.
Yeah. No,
and I'm just happy to accept with the fact that a lot of people who I really loved and respected, I'm learning more about what really makes them tick, and it breaks my heart. But I made a commitment to Jesus, and so I got to follow him, and everybody else is going to make their own decisions. So I want just thank you for letting me be here. Sorry for the long-winded
not at
answer,
all.
but I got a lot more long-winded things to say, and that's why the book writing is good. And I have a blog. It's called the Two Spies Report on WordPress. And I originally started doing that so people wouldn't think I was dead. When I went underground writing the world's longest book series with the Holy War Chronicles, which this book series right now, this trilogy that I'm doing called Two Masters, Two Gospels, sort of preempted that because I was, convinced by some other close friends there was a sense of urgency to this message. So I did the Two Spies Report, let people know it's still out there. It was originally meant to be brief commentaries on current event things, maybe placeholders on my thoughts. I can go back and write a book later. Well, they turned out to be about as long as my book. So I have the world's longest post on here, but these are momentous days. I mean, the last, 5 years, but 4 to 6 months in particular, we are at momentous decisions that we have to make over what we're about, and there are far-reaching consequences.
Yeah.
And they're extremes. This is not like fine print, fine points. These are fundamentally what Jesus is about, what his priorities are, and we have to decide and figure out what it is and where we stand. So I've been a busy beaver, writing a lot of stuff at the Two Spies Report. It's named that because of Joshua and Caleb, which it's a Christian minority report.
Right.
And the theme is just because a minority of believers have a view doesn't mean necessarily wrong. Yeah. And so I make it a forum for stuff that I know rubs against the grain of the Bible Belt people where I live and come from.
Yeah,
so,
it's very cool.
It's stuff that make people uncomfortable. If you like to be uncomfortable, like laying on a bed of nails, that's sort of what it's like reading my blog, but it's well intended. So anyway, but the book, I know is what we're going to be talking about here, because if I had to die tomorrow, I always second guess everything I do, but I have to say in this book, I don't regret one sentence in this book. I completely stand behind it. We all should grow, and hopefully we'll do things better over time. And hopefully I will. This was my first solo effort that wasn't done as part of some kind of, combination with others. But as of today, I don't regret a word of it. I believe every word that's in it.
Cool. So let's dig into that, because the book is called Two Masters and Two Gospels, Volume 1, The Teaching of Jesus versus the Leaven of the Pharisees in Talk Radio and Cable News. And, I was seeing some smatterings of people calling you a communist and socialist and all this kind of stuff, and we'll dig into that. But I was prompted to read through the whole thing just because of the response I was seeing. I was like, well, what exactly is Dr. Future saying that's causing people to start calling him a communist? And I got through it, but it seems to me that pretty straightforward. It's in the title, but the book seems to be parsing out one's allegiance between a genuine faith in Jesus Christ versus allegiance to the constructed faith by government propagandists who use Christianity in America to create a generation, multiple generations of loyal citizens to the state. And I think the things you found to back up that concept that, hey, they've been using Christianity to back up or to create a generation, multiple generations of loyal citizens to the state is pretty alarming to me. But why do you think the difference? It's a difference that I think people don't recognize. But why do you think it's such an important difference for our generation and the future of the church?
Well, I really need to clarify what is the main emphasis of the book, because it really is not at all to issue a warning about the state itself.
Sure.
Although we should be wary of any institution. Yeah. Including the institutional church, I might say. Mm-hmm. Rather, my main emphasis is that the last 5 years, I'll just say, we call it the Trump era, whatever you want to say, have shown to me, as I get it into the beginning of the book, that the fact that my fellow Bible-believing evangelical Christians that I interact with at my church here, right here in the Bible Belt, Nashville, or my family or friends and online, normally use the talking points in terms that I know originated recently on talk radio or cable news. Right. Or their online counterparts, rather than the words of Jesus, the Father, the prophets, the apostles, on all the controversial public issues of the day. And believe me, I talk with them on all of it. but I find they're using these talking points that I know when they were issued and where they got them from. And I find that curious that they're not saying, well, Jesus said, blah, blah, blah. So I assert this is because that they are saturated with this ideology all week long. On their commutes back and forth. They're a captive audience in the car, hearing talk radio. They have the radio on sometimes at work, sometimes subliminally low. And then they get home after hearing it again on the way home, and they turn on cable news when they're eating dinner, and even on Sunday mornings before they head to church. And you contrast that to less than an hour of a sermon they have each week. At a good church, you might get an occasional sermon about the Sermon on the Mount or Kingdom of Heaven. And so it's an issue of oversaturation. And so this alternative view that comes through these channels of strangers directly into the skulls of my fellow Christians, it normally makes certain presuppositions about society and values that I know are not biblically supported. You know, even though they're spoken of well by a lot of Christian leaders and celebrities, I know they're not biblically supported. You know, if I had to throw a blanket over them, I would say you could associate them with what I call wealth class values. The kind of values of the wealthy, the idle rich, big business corporations, banking, how they look at other people, what their value is, what we should value in society. You know, if you grew up watching the Beverly Hillbillies and saw Mr. Drysdale, you know, the banker, or Thurston Howell III on Gilligan's Island, or even Mr. Burns on The Simpsons, it's the kind of values you hear them talking about. How did they value other people? You know, what were their values in society? It holds the poor in contempt and automatically assumes that they're lazy and an exploitative burden. They look at the immigrant stranger as distrusted and only worthy to be economically exploited. That's all they want is cheap labor. But they don't want them for anything else but just cheap labor. And then it venerates the businessman and business itself as the saviors of society.
Right.
And because of that, because they are the geniuses that just work magic in society, you know, and that's why a lot of them are invited to speak at our pulpits. Between that and like Delta Force people, you know, they're the celebrities that come and speak at our pulpits, write the big best-selling books in Christian circles. And so it venerates this businessman and business as the savior of society, and thus seeks to privatize all societal functions.
Yeah.
Because obviously things will be better for all of us if we just turn the keys over to them. You know, it sees government as the enemy of everyone. And I know I've spent my time in FutureQuake many times criticizing the government. And I have said elsewhere that, you know, in a few years in FutureQuake, I walked through the Libertarian Garden and I saw some real flowers in there. I saw flowers like right of free association, right of non-coercion, these kind of things. And they're real values that add to my Christian experience. But then as I dug in further down there, I found a lot of weeds down there, which were no more than Darwinian laws of the jungle.
Yeah.
In fact, I would say not only are they not Christian and immoral, they really even counteract the idea of civilization. It's not really a civilization that lives the way they say. It's really a jungle. So, you know, the consistent theme, and I know you've seen this in my book, this constant argument that government is endemically the enemy of everyone because it taxes them. You know, although the big business people like all the credit kickbacks they get and contracts and other corporate welfare, they like that. But in the fact that regulations are applied that would limit their impact on other people from defrauding them or polluting their neighbor's property or working their workers to death for starvation wages and dangerous working conditions, which is why unions are the devil too. You know, all of this has a threat of potentially shaving a sliver off of their windfall profits. Therefore, to them, it's an existential threat. And their goal was to convince all of us it's our threat as well, too.
Right.
Now, I will say, and I know you know, that I make this part exhaustively, clearly in the book, is that all of this is completely counter to the values of God in the Bible, both in the Old Testament, the Gospels, and the Epistles. And I painstakingly document all of that in wall-to-wall verses in passages that make it consistent. I also tie it to a biblical analogy of the gospel era antecedents of the religious right called the Pharisees in the gospel era time. And I carefully document all of their positions and values that come up in the Gospels about what they thought about the poor, what they thought about how to relate to government, all these other kind of things. And all of them match up with the wealth class values, including having a selective piety at times, being very conspicuous when they do an occasional charity to somebody, but yet they don't want any kind of broad economic assistance to the people that they keep under their thumb, which is what Jesus said explicitly. He says they burden them with all these burdens. They don't lift a finger to take the burden off. And this is why they saw Jesus as their arch enemy. Particularly, and I think this is the thing people need to understand, what Jesus saw is one of the big problems. Obviously, he came primarily to this world to die on the cross and provide eternal life for all of us. Okay. And that nothing was going to sway him from that. He's preaching about the kingdom of heaven. But his first public act when he showed up in Jerusalem was to tear down the den of thieves in the temple, which I found out through my study of history. That whole racket was being run by the high priest, Annas. It was the religious institutional people running the economic racket, and his sons were running it. And he knew, Jesus knew that when you hit religious people in their pocketbook, that's when they'll take notice and start coming after you. And they did. And he intended for that, to show the difference of him from them. I also didn't realize he did it a second time. That was one of his very last acts, which is what triggered them to decide we got to kill him now.
Yeah.
He's hitting our economic racket system. They were like TV evangelists of their day, but they were in partnership with big business. And that's when they immediately met and said, we got to take this guy out.
Yeah.
Now, encounter, the government authority at the time, Rome, was not really Jesus' real enemy. In fact, they looked for outs, except, they had this sort of relationship with the religious institution. They didn't want to stir the apple cart, but that wasn't the real enemy. But it was the institutional religious fundamentalist, along with the conservative wealthy traditionalists, the Sadducees, and the wealth class, were the ones who saw themselves as the real enemy of Jesus. And that is still true today, as I lay out in the history in my book section.
Yeah.
And that's why they turned to alternative to Jesus, like the sadistic but very patriotic Jesus Barabbas. He made it very, very clear in the scripture. They had a choice between two, and they chose this guy. And he was really a violent sadist, self-absorbed zealot. But they chose him because he was very patriotic. And him and the zealot, henchmen offered to them to make Israel great again.
Yeah.
And that's what they cared than the simple message of Jesus Christ. So some things never really change.
Right. I think the wording when I said state, that probably wasn't the proper word. I'm glad you parsed that, or at least just, corrected me on that, because certainly what we'll get into, we'll talk about some of the ways the government and the church work together in creating an environment that sort of garnered a distraction from the true gospel message. In fact, I would go so far as call it another gospel. Another gospel,
because it's
absolutely
not even on the same foundation. The foundation values about the people on the margins, the poor in spirit. You go back and look at the Beatitudes and put a minus sign in front of everything, and that's the other gospel that I'm talking about. And it's become the main thing of Christian talk radio. Take the Beatitudes, put a minus sign in front of it, and that's the value system you see on that, or their cable television programs and things like that.
Yeah,
that's why he called it the leaven of the Pharisees.
Right.
And that's what the ideology, and it was always a wealth-centered thing. In fact, at the beginning of the book, I put a verse out of the Bible to help really frame this discussion, because it said that the Pharisees hated Jesus because they were lovers of money.
Yeah. Yeah.
And once you understand and think about it, they were lovers of money. They were already ingratiated to big business. They had a racket that they were running. That explains why they were so appalled and felt threatened by Jesus. And they still feel that way today.
Yeah, I think your analogy with the Pharisees to the modern evangelical conservative arm, at first, when you just hear that, especially if you are conservative or evangelical or you identify as one, you sort of think, no, that's not possible.
Mm-hmm.
But then you laid it out. You laid out the case, and it's pretty compelling because it's both. It's the religious institution, basically, preaching another gospel, as you said. And when you lay it out that way and you lay out the examples, it's pretty hard to deny. I think what people tend to forget is that Jesus is not really. It doesn't mean if you reject those thoughts or you reject those identifications, it doesn't mean you're a liberal, Democrat, left wing, progressive. All those two-party thinking, the right wing, left wing type of thought. I think people fall into that way too much. And because you criticize one side, you're automatically identifying with the other side. And that's not the case either. I think people have to recognize that there is that is a dualistic type of thing that I think Jesus came to expose both sides, if you will. And I think
that's the picture you saw with the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Right. Exactly.
They were arguing a lot, but they weren't even asking the right questions to begin with.
Yeah.
You had two corrupt groups fighting, and they wanted him to pick sides. They wanted him to, like over the resurrection stuff, they wanted him to pick sides. And Jesus may have been okay and had cover had he chosen to pick sides.
Mm-hmm.
Paul was presented in the same situation. Paul decided that the time was right because they were going to tear him apart at the time, and he wasn't called to die on the cross just yet, like Jesus was.
Right.
And he went on and said something about the resurrection, and you saw the Pharisees and the Sadducees go at each other.
Mm-hmm.
So this false duality, basically what it says is that you're putting something else in your bucket to carry around, water for somebody else other than Jesus.
Yeah.
And you mentioned at the beginning of the show about these people who were saying, well, Mike's speaking about the poor and how the poor ought to be looked after and how they can get exploited in the courts or in the marketplace, or the immigrant stranger that talked about. Well, I have an opinion that an opinion, and here's one of my maxims: an opinion says as much about the opiner as it does its subject.
Mm-hmm.
So when somebody expresses an opinion about something important like this, they're really saying as much about themselves as they are what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Because we always measure things where we're standing from. So, if speaking up for the poor and speaking up for the people who exploited is communism, I think that says a little bit about the people who are making the comments as much as it does me. Because by that criteria, there's a whole lot of people thrown in that bucket with me, like Jesus of Nazareth, Paul, all of the prophets that I quote verbatim in my book and elsewhere. I got a lot of company in that camp, if that's what the definition is.
Yeah.
And so, the real, for someone who takes the message of the gospel seriously, you got two paths. You get the path of following Jesus and what he says about the kingdom and how the way the world works, or you got other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He didn't have like a whole bunch of ideologies spit up, which are I think the devil distracts us and has us fight about the wrong questions and the wrong issues. And I think we need to say, did Jesus give us an accurate picture of this world and the next one, or not?
Yeah.
And how do we respond to it?
Yeah, and a theme of mine in the last several months to close to a year has been Matthew 7:13, talking about enter through the narrow gate, because it really does feel like the path to truth is pretty narrow, and wide is the gate. Broad is the road that leads to destruction. Well, you can go lean on the right side of the road, or the left side of the road. It's wide, but that's all leading to destruction. So,
back in his day, everybody tried to find their favorite rabbi to follow, and it was all following rabbis. And that's no difference than what we do with our TV evangelists today, or religious celebrities. In fact, they're even trying to bring rabbis back in. And what Jesus called them, he said, they're all blind guides. And it says when you follow a blind guide, both they and the people they lead are going to fall into a ditch.
Yeah.
So I would say we might spend a little bit less time listening to these third parties and a little bit more time just taking the words of Christ at face value
Yeah.
They're still relevant. They still work. They have implications for the world that we live in. And that's why in my book, I sort of push the envelope further. And, most of the people never get to page 168, which is the history section, which gives some historical veracity to the claims that I'm making. Because when I talk about the leaven of the Pharisees, and I go through about 30 attributes of what they showed about how much they hated the poor, how much they tried to kiss up to the government and come up with all sorts of, kickbacks and money with them. Then I go and take it to today and talk about the gospel of Hannity, Limbaugh, Fox News, and conservative media. And I compare that on, 25 or 30 issues of today, all the hot button issues. And I compare, here's what Jesus said with the apostles, the prophets, the others. And here's what they say on their show. And surprise, surprise, there's no overlap. Now, I was raised on all those. My wife and I, after we got married, we were down there in New York at Fox and Friends, outside the window waving, like goofballs. That was on all the time in our house. I listened to all that, And so that's in the middle of my culture. Yeah. That's what I've been raised in church. It's everything that I've been a part of. But what I've been trying to do these last years of being underground is start peeling back the onion and seeing what's Jesus and what's not quite Jesus.
Right.
And most of religious culture falls into the not quite Jesus part of thing. It feels good. It's comfortable culture for me. It makes me feel secure. Doesn't really challenge me very much. I can still dislike people who are different, that look different than me or were raised different than me. But none of that's Jesus. And so that's what this book tries to do, is to give biblical justification for people to ask the unspeakable, is to actually ask, are they, and this is why I say that which we do not critique, we worship. That probably a good definition of worship is when you no longer critique something, you're worshiping it. And so when we critique all of this, like I say in the beginning of my book, it is an act of worshiping Jesus. Because I want to critique all the things that sound good at first pass and sound comfortable to me and very Christian-y. And I'll look at, does it really measure up to what Jesus was about? And most of the stuff flunks. And so I sort of grieve. I go through a grieving cycle because that was part of who I was in my culture, in my circle. But Jesus expects no less than that.
Yeah.
So that's part of what it's a difficult journey for the reader, for the people who stay and get all the way to the end of the book. And also, it's long. It's not like a little blog or a Facebook meme, right. Or a picture.
Yeah.
Because people need to have 100 things splashing on their screen like it's a video game. They're used to seeing robots stomping on buildings. They're not used to having something where they have to spend an hour or more mulling over the implications to their world of timeless truth.
Yeah.
And until we get back to that, and I'm not saying necessarily my book or whatever, but a quality book, later you've mentioned Chesterton as somebody who caught your eye for my writing. Those kind of people, until we go back and reflect on the basics, we're only going to get deeper and deeper in the hole.
Yeah.
We have incredible communication technologies today. I mean, we live in the ultimate information age. If you're willing to invest the time, you can get to the bottom of what's true or not true on almost anything, down to source material. It's a miracle. But people don't want to invest the time to do it.
Right. Yeah.
It feels a lot better to send a meme that's sort of catchy and makes you inflate your chest on who you are than to go through and find out, have I been misled?
Yeah. Yeah. It's very true. And I think part of that has been the reason why we're, especially in this country, we find ourselves in this situation is because of some pretty specific, psychological operations to really mess with the way we think. To kind of bridge into some of the specifics, I remember thinking maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I read stuff that the progressives and leftists, liberals, what they would say about certain things about the right wing and the conservative crowd.
Right.
And they'll bring up, those guys don't care about the poor or the needy or whatever. And I remember thinking well, maybe they do, but they express it in a different way. But then how are these progressives, how are they showing that they care so much if their solutions aren't necessarily the most viable solutions or whatever it might be. But I think reading through, especially that first part of the book, it really made me think about, okay, can we actually come together with people that we disagree with on some very straightforward Sermon on the Mount type of basic stuff that we can agree upon? And they're very simple. They're not very complicated when you distill it down to the foundation of what Jesus was talking about and how to treat each other. And I think that gets lost. And I kept wondering, why are we so distracted, lost when it comes to that conversation? And why are we so swayed by the politics and the whatever, all that stuff? And I think part of it, you mentioned earlier about, we're spending way more time watching Fox News or, whatever it might be, InfoWars.
Or a YouTube video.
Or YouTube. Well, nowadays, YouTube and all these different platforms. And you got,
if you're under the age of 50, that's where you get your information.
Yeah. And then you spend 45 minutes on a Sunday or something listening to a sermon. So of course you're getting a majority of your information from these from the general public talking about it. And so obviously the message gets lost, but I'm glad you got into some of the details too, because that's what I was curious about. And I was wondering, okay, is this something that just happened, or was there a progression, and how long has that progression been going? And so the first question I have here about that you mentioned in your book, an author named Jonathan Herzog, and he wrote a book called The Spiritual Industrial Complex. And I'd love for our audience to know why that book is important and what you found in your research of the spiritual industrial complex.
Okay. Well, the other thing I need to clarify on this, and I'll explain a little bit about him, is that this whole section of the book at the beginning of the history chapter was only really a preamble. Mm-hmm. And what I wanted to use it for was for the skeptic who I write my work for. I just innately write for somebody who I know was going to casually reject what I'm, alleging. That they would believe it's impossible on what I allege in the main part of my book, which is that there was a particular time around 1940 when the National Association of Manufacturers, the Chamber of Commerce, was convinced by the first prosperity gospel preacher, James Fifield, that the way to rehabilitate the horrible reputation and public image of big business, which had been seen as dragging us into the Great Depression because of their greed and their hubris, was to target the clergy and to refashion and re-overhaul a gospel that took out blessed are the poor in spirit and all of these other things that they thought were anathema, and to take government, which was authorized by God, and I showed the scriptures, to protect the poor in the courts and in the marketplace from the dishonest weights and measures, which is typified in Revelation 18, the great city Babylon. Okay, it's not a government, it is an economic system that controls the lives and affairs of men. And that they actually were successful in getting the clergy over to basically throwing out the basic teaching. And in fact, there had been a revival in care about the downtrodden at the beginning of the 20th century with the progressive movement and what they call the social gospel people. That's the name they hung on as a derogatory thing. But these horrible, terrible people you hear about, the social gospel people, were actually going into the slums that had been developed during the industrial age and going out there and helping these poor, wretched souls that had no health care. They couldn't read. They couldn't go to school. They were illiterate. They had doomed lives, short lifespans. The average lifespan in 1900 was 35 years old in America. Wow. And so the industrial age had pulled these people off the farms, put them in these, teeming cities, and they were pitiful. And so somehow God did a move where Christians started getting a conscience about it. And then there was the great pushback. The empire struck back. And even though the Great Depression was a terrible low point for the reputation of big business, they were able to concoct this thing where they basically bankrolled a Christian media that made government the enemy, the New Deal an enemy, jobs programs an enemy, Social Security, veterans benefits. These were all the devil. And this is what they did. So what I do at the beginning of that section to show people an example of how this could possibly happen with these supposedly spirit-filled Christians and leaders that we venerate in the Christian world, how could they swallow and buy something so anti-Christian, is I show how it was done in spades at the beginning of the Cold War. And that's what leads into Dr. Herzog. Dr. Herzog, I try to just use people for my references that are top in their field. And he is one of these people. He's a PhD in history from Stanford. He worked at the conservative Hoover Institution think tank, so he's conservative credentials. And this book it's an award-winning book. And he shows how the Christian community, first their leadership and then the rank and file, were co-opted by political figures who had an agenda other than the kingdom of heaven at stake, and how easily they were able to turn the rudder and get them focused on something else other than just purely kingdom of heaven values. And they were seduced by earthly agendas, and they was wrapped up in the phoniest of religious wrappings. I mean, once your eyes are open, you have to roll your eyes at what they got away with.
Yeah.
But it works because they appeal to the pride of people, whether it's patriotic pride or ethnic pride or whatever, and what I call the electness of being, an exceptional American. Of course, we anoint ourselves exceptional, just like prophets these days anoint themselves prophets. We call ourselves exceptional because we want to be. And a lot of that Calvinism, elect teachings from the Puritans has percolated through all the rest of us, that we're better than everybody else. And so anytime you got a message wrapped in that, Christians buy it hook, line, and sinker. And so I'll give you a little bit more about how they did that, if you'd like for me to elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah.
Most of us Christians know about David Barton. I assume you do.
Yep.
Even on TV all the time. He's made a fortune constructing a mythology about America being founded like a type of church itself. But what many Christians don't know is that this mythology of iconic images like Washington praying in the snow, at Valley Forge, and the divine destiny of America was largely created in the boardrooms of the White House during the Truman and Eisenhower administration on specific dates and events we can track, that was collectively involving heads of wartime propaganda, from World War II propaganda experts, and intelligence agencies were involved, big business CEOs and heads, along with senior Christian leaders, all in the same rooms, and they were crafting a mythology that they dispersed at great expense across multiple media platforms to sell the public the idea that the Cold War was a religious holy war. It wasn't just a war between two competing political ideologies, but it was actually a religious holy war, which it had not been conceived of at that time, and that America had a spiritual destiny. And you've seen some religious teachers work so hard they can to try to find America in the pages of the Bible so they can give some kind of the slimmest of legitimacy to that. And that from that time, back in the late 40s, the generations we've come up to really have generally not questioned those premises, at least in the conservative circles I've been in. In fact, most of them assume that a lot of the things that I'm going to mention, the things that are iconic things like the In God We Trust and One Nation Under God, go back to the founding of America. But they don't. They go back to our grandparents' age, and they were all done within a couple-year period of time, and were back fit as part of our mythology. And the reason why Dr. Herzog says that Truman and the other American leaders at the time were worried that Americans would find communism actually desirable over unbridled capitalism. Now, the question I have is, why would they find that desirable? We were learning about Bolshevism. Now, granted, Papa Joe Stalin was like our favorite guy in the early 40s fighting the Nazis, and he was promoted and told how good he is, and then it changes on a dime when we're fighting off against. And obviously it was a brutal regime that is inexcusable. But, in their whims, he's good until he's not good, or until he's a rival. And so they were worried that communism would look attractive to America, which shows you the kind of paranoia that these figures have, because they know themselves that the corporate world that we have, even back then, going back to the robber barons, the whole industrial age, the Gilded Age, has fleeced America and the Western world for a long, long, long time. And they're always afraid that they're going to be exposed, that finally the people are going to get wise to what's going on and start listening to the people that warned them. Well, he was worried about that. And so what they did in their normal overreaction was that they brainstormed and they said, well, the only thing we've got over communism is that they went and said that they were atheists. So we're going to exploit that one attribute to the public. And what we're going to have to do to get people to sacrifice what we want them to sacrifice, particularly to build the defense military establishment, is we've got to make it a spiritual holy war. And that's what he did. He made it a holy war. And the key event that really kicked it off was in May 1947 at the White House, where they brought in all the top CEOs in America because they had the biggest vested interest in fighting communism. They had the most to lose. And all the media moguls that ran the networks, radio and TV, they met in the Justice Department, and they called this group the American Heritage Foundation. And they had the task of creating a generic faith, or what we now call a civil religion, that the war propaganda and the psychological warfare experts who were there could use on the American public. Now, these guys were paid, the intelligence agencies were not supposed to affect the American public. They were supposed to target outsiders. But it was turned around and used on the people that paid their salaries, the American public.
Yeah.
And so some of the things they did was create this thing called the Freedom Train, that they put America's founding documents like they were sacred relics, like you had the Ark of the Covenant on it. And it was patterned, actually, ironically, on the Lenin train. That Lenin did the same thing with their communist documents around. They had a faith pledge, like a pledge of freedom. And in fact, a lot of them, they took them in front of churches, and they would make churches. You had to go pledge your, total unyielding allegiance to Western capitalism, and what that was about at the church altar. Which is a place I consider an embassy of the kingdom of heaven. It's really real estate of another kingdom, but that's what they were doing there at the altar. Everybody's standing around you, of course, you better sign this. These are loyalty oaths, basically, they're getting. They even taught the 4th of July was a religious holiday.
Yeah.
So this was so widespread. Just one of these incidences, they had an incident in the Sugar Bowl where they had 75,000 people there, all basically coerced to sign this pledge simultaneously there. And so they started promoting groups like these propaganda outfits like Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which were supposed to send propaganda behind the Iron Curtain, and had guys like Herbert Hoover, the FBI chief, behind this. They even sold to the public that it was totally a grassroots effort, intentionally deceive the American public that it was all funded by these little kids collecting nickels and dimes at their schools, where they would have to bring this so that people could hear behind the Iron Curtain. They never said that the CIA was funding it all completely on their own, because then they would know it would taint what they were doing. So they made this thing, and they took everybody's money as if it was some kind of secular grassroots effort that they were doing. But they built so much of what we take for granted today. This big business intelligence agency, clergy leadership consortium, over the next 15 months produced this foundational document that created our culture called One Nation Under God. It was just like an intelligence assessment. And they said in this document, quote, that there's a need to weld religion to democracy.
Yeah.
And for, quote, public comparisons between the Bible and America's most revered national documents if we were to win the Cold War. So that started a chain of events, all funded by the government. Now, people will say, hey, these are all good things. But they're getting into spiritual matters that are totally for somebody else's agenda. One of the things that they didn't do with all this God talk that they were doing and in the national dialogue and paying for, there was nothing discussed about kingdom of heaven agenda, which is what Jesus' talk is supposed to be about. how do people come in the kingdom of heaven? How do people, converted to follow Jesus and to be prepared for the world to come? None of that was part of this. They were using God talk to achieve a political ideological purpose. And so they started by getting things like this "in God we trust" phrase. They came up, I'm sure they had their advertising agency guys, because the advertising council was in it. They probably tested it with audiences.
Yeah.
Does this make you feel warm or feel good? They suddenly started putting on all the currency, redid the currency. The national motto was changed. They even put it on stamps and canceled letters. They even got businesses to start putting it on their utility bills. They added it to the end of the Pledge of Allegiance, which ironically was actually the Pledge of Allegiance was come up by some Baptist socialist.
Right.
Yeah, he was a guy who wrote a book, Jesus is a Socialist. He's the guy that did it, and they added "under God" on it. And the people who fought it at the time were the Christian leaders, because they were cheapening religion by doing something like this. They were taking something sacred and they were adding it to the profane, so that people would make these statements and go through the motions. We're talking about very serious things about following God, and they're making it very banal.
Mm-hmm.
And even Eisenhower, who took this and bought into it in spades, he got in the act. He was of Jehovah's Witness background.
Right.
And he wasn't really part of religion. Well, he decided, I'll go get baptized in a Presbyterian church because it would look better. It would help sell this.
That's right.
I mean, that's how committed they were to true spiritual issues.
Right.
So, I mean, they paid and they sent out, I think it was like 680,000 copies of the Pledge of Allegiance, adding this phrase to it, just trying to drill it into people's head. America equals God. God equals America. They built this congressional prayer room. This is a good little archetype of it, where they put in a stained glass window with this idea they came up with of Washington, on one knee praying at Valley Forge. And the whole thing was to make him look like a saint, like they do the saints at a lot of churches.
Right.
I mean, they were clever in how they affect our psychology of how we look at things. In fact, in the House report on when they voted on accepting the national motto "In God We Trust," they said it had psychological value.
I mean, they just say it.
None of that are kingdom motives at all.
Yeah.
And what they do, there's a lot more like that. But all that stuff that we think were from the founding of our country was a part of who we were. No, there was some ad agency and intelligence people, along with clergymen, who got in a boardroom over a set of months and came up, and they spent a lot of taxpayer money. And their whole purpose was not to spread the gospel one iota.
Yeah. A lot of the things you're talking about here, I was reminded of a recent event. I think it's about a year ago as of this recording. But former retired Lieutenant General Michael Flynn made a video, I think it was on 4th of July, making an oath, which is usually taken to the members of the House and Senate. And one of the lines is, quote, "Will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic." And at the end, he says, "Where we go one, we go all." And then he says, "God bless America."
Yeah.
And this video of him doing it was shared, especially amongst the QAnon followers. They love this.
That's their phrase.
It was their phrase. And all these people on social media started reciting the oath and posting themselves reciting it. And I mean, at that point, I was already I never really bought into QAnon, but that was like one of those moments where I'm like, hey guys, can you see the psyop here? Can you tell that this is not what they're trying? This is something else. Not to mention a video I did a year ago. I pointed out how the QAnon, all the Q posts never mentioned Jesus once. They literally never mentioned his name one time. So all these
has nothing
Christians,
to do with it.
Yeah.
Nor his values.
Yeah. So
it has nothing to do with it. But now they would like to use Christians for the muscle.
Yes.
For the goons. It's like they get goons in because they got the muscle. And that's what I think, in hindsight, having voted Republican most of my life, that's what I think the Republican Party has done. It's like Lucy holding the football. Oh, we're going to give you this. We're going to give you that religious right. And they just don't ever quite get around to doing it. And they'll say, well, next time we'll do it, but we do need your vote. When the things that they get, like the tax plan that was approved, a few years ago, the whole lion's share was for big business. I mean, they cut corporate taxes in half. They threw a tiny bone to the rest of us. But the big thing was for the rest of these guys, you know who they really respond to and who they're working to. But, you know, maybe QAnon was right on one little point. At least they're starting to get the pedophiles now in high-level office with Matt Gaetz, you know, and the other Republican officials. I don't know if that's quite what they were selling as the pedophile network.
No.
You know, I don't think that's who they were targeting, but maybe the pedophiles would. It'd just not be quite the pedophiles they thought were going to be.
Right.
You know?
Well,
sort of like Harry Hyde and those other guys,
Yeah.
and, you know, the stuff that they did, you know.
Yeah, they come from both sides of the aisle. But yeah, getting back to the idea of having muscle, I did have as part of my notes here in the questions too, in 1947, Truman ordered the universal military training for young men.
Right.
And I believe the quote was to, quote, morally and spiritually engineer the U.S. Army, which you had talked about, and to, quote, create a perfect soldier who could ground lethal capability in a religious framework. I mean, that was like, whoa, that is crazy.
Yeah. 1947, ran the program at Fort Knox, not far from where I live right now and where I grew up. But I mean, basically, how's any difference than that in the Mujahideen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
It's a Mujahideen holy warrior. And so, you know, the military is so overwhelming on these impressionable 18-year-olds.
Yeah.
You know, you're awestruck by the institutional power and trappings of these people, these larger than life, not only boot camp people, but the whole system around you, that you basically can mold them to whatever you want. And that's the whole point of boot camp. They mold people into killing machines, remorseless killing machines that don't ask questions when they're given orders. And it's a pretty simple kind of thing. You know, I've been studying a lot lately about hypnotism, stage hypnotism and things like that. And I'm starting to learn from them that a lot of the surefire techniques they use to make people totally suggestible are the same things that I see the signs and wonders people do when they do like the slain in the spirit stuff and things.
Right.
This is old news. This is stuff that the hypnotists were doing for a long time.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I read in there is they said that fear is one of the main keys to make people easy pickings for hypnotists, to make people suggestible.
Interesting.
And they were giving examples of people who were tough people and said, oh, we can't be hypnotized. They said, you call them up on the stage. He says, it's actually a mask for fear. And they said, fear creates, I was reading this from the guy who's considered the dean of hypnotists, Ormond McGill. He says that it bewilders the brain. And when it bewilders the brain, I guess it makes it open for somebody who brings orderly, strong commands to them. So an external force says, do this. And they said what happens is you bring one of these tough guys in a heckler, and they're actually afraid of being hypnotized. You bring them up, and they said what you do is you sort of surprise them. You grab them by the back of the head and tap them on the forehead. Now, if you've seen these things on the religious shows, you know, they said they'll go down immediately.
Yeah, interesting.
Now, there's no Holy Spirit involved in that.
Yeah.
They said they take them straight down, and they said, go asleep. And the people just go straight to sleep because they said fear does this. And that's why all the stuff I get in my in basket, there's tons of religious ministries, you know, I do a lot of opposition research. So they're dumping all their stuff in my email, all fear-based, because it makes people swallow anything.
Yeah.
And they know the best buttons. Oh, well, there's a pedophile network everywhere, and it's under a pizza parlor, and it's doing all this kind of stuff. It's like you got them eating out of their hands. You can sell whatever political position, candidate, or whatever, because you've terrified the people. And that's why in many ways, and I'll have a little sympathy on the Cold War. You know, I mean, there was a real powerful nation that had nukes and stuff like that. I mean, compared to the anti-Sharia craziness, this actually, at least we're not just a bunch of guys hiding in caves. I mean, these were real people.
Right.
But as we find out later, it was grossly oversold. When they did the Team B report or Team A report, we found out later that they lied to us on all the capabilities of Russia, grossly overdid because they wanted to sell defense contracts. They had to build defense military contract, but they had to scare everybody.
Yeah, the sensationalizing of everything. And we see it everywhere now.
People will sign on the dotted line, you know. Oh no, I need covers for my gutters because What happens if I get leaves in my gutters? All you got to do is scare people. You're going to fall off a ladder. You better get that on there. It's the oldest trick in the book.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
What if your neighbors come over and find you have waxy yellow buildup on your floor? You better buy what we're selling. And so that's what they did on a national level with this. But what they found is, you know, I mean, here they brainwash in Korea and things like that. Why not do it just with this and do religious stuff this way? So what they did was they actually took all these young people, they took every one of them, profiled them on their religion, and then they coerced each of them into some taxpayer-paid religious conversion decision in the program. So in other words, they put pressure on them. And you know how authentic those kind of decisions to follow God will be.
Right.
They coerced them in a big room to make a decision so they could check off a box at that point. And then they just deluged them with hours of weekly religious services, personal time with the chaplain, and they even instructed local church congregations to keep drilling in their brain that our nation was founded on religious principles.
Yeah.
Now, I will say this about this, just like I do about the big business changing of the Christian mind, which is the biggest bulk of my book.
Mm-hmm.
Why do these people have to spend so much money selling us on ideas so hard if it's naturally true? If it's something that we instinctively see is true and right, how come they have to bring in the big guns of salespeople? You know, you don't get the top level attorneys to represent you when it's obvious to everybody that you're innocent in a court case.
Yeah.
Okay. It's when you're clearly, you know, like an O.J. Simpson guy that you have to bring in the people that can turn everybody's thinking on their head. And that's why they spent so much time and effort on things that were non-natural ideas. And that's why the religious leaders at the time, back then, they actually had, you know, some brain molecules at the time, and they protested this, and they said it was an un-American form of religious indoctrination. And eventually what they found out was they immersed these people, and it was like a cult, nonstop religious, drilling in their head. As soon as they backed off in the early 60s, the people went back to being a typical soldier, going out hanging out at the bar, the stripper club, doing what soldiers do. Some of them went to church, some of them went to other, but it was no different than what it was before they did it. So it had no real good purpose. It was a waste of time. But the weird thing is that they kept this kind of training in the officers' corps. And to this day, they still have the same kind of thing, including drilling the 10 Commandments in them, which I hate to have to tell them, but, you know, I'm under the new covenant, not under the law, you know. Jesus nailed those commandments to the cross in Colossians, having paid the price for it. But they're still drilling that stuff in their head of the officers. And that's why we get guys like a General Jerry Boykin, second in command there at Family Research Council, saying all sorts of insane things, joining Knights of Malta, trying to get groups to assassinate Islamic leaders. You know, General Boykin was the guy who sent this other, quote, Christian ministry that took Bibles, sent them over to North Korea, you know, to take Bibles. And if the North Koreans bothered them, then it was, of course, Christian persecution. Well, what came out later, it was discovered underneath the Bibles, they were putting military diagnostic and communication devices underneath the Bibles in North Korea to help support an invasion of North Korea. This is who Jerry Boykin sent in, the Christian man. Now, what does that do to the church in North Korea? What kind of pushback is an already paranoid government worried about a U.S. taking them over do when you find out the Christian people under the guise of Christian work are doing that kind of stuff?
Right.
This is what a generation of training, this kind of myopic, non-reflective kind of spiritual pursuit, you end up with insanity.
Yeah. Yeah. And the concept of saving Western civilization, saving Christianity. I think you've touched on some of these points, and you mentioned it earlier about why they were framing everything as fighting communism, and the effects, the role that the church played, the role media played.